this is not his only book. He's written a number of books about this, but this is his latest one, and it's just amazing. In this book, there is, here, I'll show you the table of contents. He goes into, the beginning of magic. He goes into science and magic. What's the difference? So he basically, explains how psychic effects and magic are the same, and that there actually is already a lot of science that has investigated this and studied it. Magical potpourri, origins of magic. This is kind of going into the background of magic, the practice of magic, how it actually works, how people have done magic in the occult traditions over time. He goes into like affirmations, force of will type magic, sigils. These are all just like kind of the Western counterparts to a lot of what what we are familiar with in yogic or tantric practices with mantra, yantras, visualization. There's just a lot of corollaries, and depending on where you're at in your studies, you might appreciate these, corollaries, or you may not. So if you think you would, you should get this book. Then we get to the real meat of the book. Basically, about 100 pages in, this book just starts becoming amazing. So the first 100 pages are kind of slow, going into like what is magic, the background, blah blah blah. Well, Webster defines magic as this, or that sort of thing. But it's actually even very good in that regard. And I wanted to know a little bit about the history of magic because I am in an occult field myself. Scientific evidence, though, wow, this is just such a good chapter. I want to reread it because I can't even retain it all, but they basically, he goes into all this evidence, all this research they've done, meta-analysis of, studies that have gone back to the 70s, blessed chocolate. They prove how blessed chocolate is a real thing, and has been, proven to have an effect. The cool thing is that basically, like, they did effects on psychic abilities, like, that could be noticed, but also things that couldn't even be noticed. Like, literally someone visualizing giving someone a massage in a room, and it's a stranger, and they never met that person, and they were monitoring that person's physiology, and literally what happened to their body was the exact physiological like levels of relaxation and like lowering of stress and lowering of metabolic rates. It was the exact same thing that happens when they did physically get a massage, and they tested that and saw the exact same things happening. They also, they go into a lot of stuff like that. So it's just amazing that it's proving how, like, faith healing, how the placebo effect, how positive visualization, how all these things really do work. Like, they just plain work. And the thing is, they work better when you see the evidence if you're a doubtful person, because I'm not even that much of a doubtful person, but I'm a scientific, I have that mind of a critical person, but I have a lot of faith. I already believed all this stuff. It was just great seeing it like critically examined and seeing that it was true. And then that's even one of the studies in here is that remote viewing and things like that. Remote viewing actually works much better if you believe it's possible. And so they even go into that in this chapter on the scientific evidence. They go into, mediums, and they study the brains of mediums. And they found that it was true that mediums are in a state of consciousness that is not the same as one when they are lying or deceiving themselves or just imagining. Like, different parts of the brain are being used. It's really interesting. They went into the studies on, psychics being able to tell if someone is dead or alive. And, theurgy even. Voodoo testing. They tested voodoo and things in this. It's really, really fascinating. Towards the end of the book, there's even a section on what does he call it? Merlin class magicians. Yeah. So towards the end, he gives you at least 3 examples of magicians who were historically documented over and over and over, and were on this tremendous Merlin-like level. And one of them was even a guy in recent times named Ted Owens. And the stories and accounts of this guy, Ted Owens, is just nutty. It's wild. Really fun reading. And then the final part is, toward a science of magic, kind of gives some information about how science and magic are kind of coming together, how in the last recent decade there's been a lot more of a shift towards allowing scientists to think about consciousness in new ways. And he goes into how hard it was for him to get his studies published, like all the studies they talk about in this book. They talk about how mainstream science journals just yanked them without any excuse. They just couldn't accept the idea that the fact that this conflicted with the materialism idea in science. And so basically like the last chapter goes into like, what is science really saying? Like, what is materialism saying? And they kind of like tear it apart, they kind of tear apart how, the scientific worldview is just not holding up to a lot of the new evidence that quantum physics shows and that all these things show. So that's a really, really cool section of this book. Goes into all these big studies that have come out in major journals like Nature or all these like major scientific journals. And there's even some really cool little like graphs and things he throws in. And at first I was like, ooh, I don't like that graph. That's not correct. And then later he shows like the more correct graph. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted. That's correct. And that's like kind of the model that they come up with at the end of the book. So it's really neat. A lot of really neat stuff in this book. So one of the best books I've read.